The very instinct to want to have a child is a noble and a pure one and should always be respected. But the church challenges those who use illicit means in order to achieve this noble end. In today's video, we'll take a look at what in vitro fertilization involves and the morality behind it, why it presents some moral challenges that are often overlooked even by practicing devout Catholics. My name is Father Jerome Magat, and I'm the Vice Rector and a Professor of Moral Theology here at St. Patrick's Seminary in Menlo Park, California. And as always, if you like our content here on the channel, please always feel free to like, subscribe, and share. As I mentioned, it's very common to be asked as a priest, Father, is IVF a sin? So the best way to understand this is to understand what IVF involves and the larger context in which IVF occurs. In general, part of Catholic morality involves the invocation or the use of what's called the natural moral law. The natural moral law is the law that we know naturally. It's the law that tells us in all cultures and all times, murder is wrong, sexual assault is wrong, theft is wrong. These are things that are not tied to any particular religious tradition, but these are known intuitively by the human person. It's the law that God has inscribed in each and every single human heart. So one of the tenets of the natural moral law reminds us that anything that substitutes for, terminates, or prevents the natural conception of human life is morally illicit. You might wonder, what are some examples of that? Well, for instance, termination would be an abortion, preventing could be contraception, and substituting for would involve in vitro fertilization. So from the get-go, we can appeal just to reason in the natural moral law to understand that in vitro fertilization is morally illicit. But of course, this often runs counter to people's intuitions, especially for Catholics who want to have families and want to have children. After all, what could be more Catholic, if you like, than wanting to have kids and a family? And the instinct to have children is very, very strong and from God, and a beautiful value that needs to be respected. But where IVF runs afoul and aground of moral problems is the means in which the ends, having a child, is achieved. So let's start from the beginning. The first moral red flag that IVF, or in vitro fertilization, raises is the manner in which the specimen, the egg and the sperm, are procured. These are not often done through morally illicit means, especially when cultivating the male specimen. Often this includes the use of pornography and self-abuse, which is never morally illicit. Then there's the complication that arises from who could the parents of the child eventually conceived and gestated to be. So for instance, an infertile couple, that means a couple unable to achieve a pregnancy, could contract with or make arrangements with a woman and a man who may not even know each other to be the egg donor and the sperm donor. And if the eventual mother, the one who's making this arrangement, herself can't bear children, which is usually the case, then that couple would have to engage the services of a surrogate mom, which would be a substitute mom for the eventual mother who actually keeps the child. So in reality, a child conceived out of IVF could technically have up to 5 parents. And this, of course, raises all kinds of other moral complications. There's a very high percentage of parents who have conceived a child through IVF who go through great efforts to hide that fact from their child. This is, of course, already a red flag, causing suspicion as to why they wouldn't want their child to know the manner in which they were brought into the world. The second moral red flag is the way that the child is conceived. The egg donor and the sperm donor, after making their donations, if you will, to the lab, allow the laboratory technician to use manipulative techniques to generate human life, creating up to, let's say, a tray of 12 different embryos, perhaps only intending one ever to be gestated and brought to term. These children are not created in a loving act, in the conjugal embrace, in the marital embrace, but they're brought together through a manipulative laboratory technique, which is rather impersonal. This, of course, again, is a violation of the natural law. Children have a right to be conceived and brought to term by their natural parents. So in a typical IVF treatment, the laboratory will produce between 10 to 12 or 14 embryos in, for lack of a better term, a tray. These embryos can be studied, and we can determine whether or not the children, these embryos, have particular characteristics. Some of the characteristics could be deemed positive. Other characteristics, especially if they're diseases, could be deemed negative. And then the couple is allowed to genetically select the 6 embryos that they'll try to implant in the mother's womb. And again, this could be a surrogate mom, and it's often the case. And then the other 6 remain cryogenically frozen in a locker. More on them later. But let's concentrate on the 6 who are placed into the mother's womb. It's very likely that only one, no more than 2 of them, will survive the process, meaning 4 could immediately be declared dead. But let's say you have an anomalous situation where 3 of these embryos are gestated. Now you have triplets. This opens the entire IVF process to what is now called selective abortion. Perhaps the parents intending to have the child only really want 1 kid. They don't want 3 children. They're not ready for 3 children. Never envisioned that could be possible. This opens now the possibility of selective abortions happening, which do happen in a number of cases. So getting now to the 1 child that is gestated and then brought to life, the baby is born and it goes home with the parents who arranged the entire IVF treatment in the first place. But what happens to those remaining 6 embryos that are cryogenically frozen and kept in the lab? There are several outcomes that might be the future of these children. For one, they can be discarded. 2, they could be sold to embryonic stem cell research labs where they will be killed for their stem cells and used for research. Some have suggested the moral aseity, although the Catholic Church has never ruled on this, on the possibility of embryo adoption, which of course involves surrogacy, so is generally ruled out. Others have suggested that perhaps we should thaw and baptize these babies to send them straight to God. But of course, that becomes morally problematic because you're taking an action against the child, which we're not allowed to do in the first place. It very well may be the case that there is no solution for these children, a true dilemma, an unsolvable problem. They would remain cryogenically frozen in that locker in a laboratory indefinitely. So it's realistic to think that throughout the developed world, wherever IVF is readily available and performed, there literally could be millions of children who are cryogenically frozen in lockers with no clear future ahead of them. This is a travesty to the human family and a real manipulation of God's creative design. In addition to these children having no certain future, it's very safe to say that these children are potential victims of human trafficking. After all, as I mentioned, these children could be sold to research, to embryonic stem cell research and the labs that perform that service. They could be adopted by other couples who want a child and go through the process of embryo adoption, or simply these children could be discarded and left for dead. In either case, it's very clear from all of these potential outcomes and for the other reasons that I cited earlier that the church does condemn the use of IVF as not only a form of human trafficking, but as a denigration of human dignity. The very instinct to want to have a child is a noble and a pure one and should always be respected. But the church challenges those who use illicit means in order to achieve this noble end. And for this reason, we must always stand by human dignity and declare that IVF is a sin. If you like this content and some of the other content we make here at St. Patrick's Seminary, always feel free to click on the links above. And as always, thanks and God bless.